Welcome, everyone. This is Carrie Hopkins-Iles with ICU DDR, and I have Dr. Pates with us for our continuing learning collaborative. Today we'll be doing writing a review paper as well as going over Dr. Chia Francis's paper submission. So welcome, everyone, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I apologise that the date on this first slide is wrong. It should be the 14th of December, not the 14th of April. So I apologise for that. What we're going to talk about today is writing a review paper. And this is quite a long session. I think we've got about 26 slides. So it'll take a bit longer than usual. And what I'd also like you to think about is that the next session we have will be the last. And I have some ideas for the presentation there, but if there are particular things you want to talk about, let me know, because we could include those as well. Okay, so first slide, please, Kerry. Right, what's a review paper? Review paper article provides a comprehensive and systematic summary of results available in a given field, while making it possible to see the topic under consideration from a new perspective. Paper draws on recent studies by other researchers to make a critical analysis and summarize, appraise, and classify available data to offer a synthesis of the latest research in a specific subject area, ultimately arriving at cumulative conclusions. And in a sense, what you're doing when you write any paper is your introduction is like a brief review of the literature. This is where you have the whole paper is a review of the literature, and they're very useful because they can draw together the literature in the field about a given topic, and comes to some conclusions which can be very useful to us. Next slide. So what are the goals of the review? Development of a theory, evaluation of a theory, state of knowledge on a specific topic, problem identification, and the provision of a historic account of the development of theory and research on a particular topic. And one of the important things about our field of study in addiction is that it is constantly changing. One thinks, well, perhaps nothing much has changed over the last 20, 30 years, but it certainly has. And review papers are particularly useful because they can bring us up to date, provided, of course, they have the most up-to-date literature within their review. And it could also identify the problems, about a certain topic or area. Next slide. Also useful in science and everyday life in policy making. One of the important things is that when authorities, whether they be governments or local authorities or whoever, or institutions, want to write policies, they need to have the evidence, and review papers are often useful for that. And you can see in the past where policy has been based on poor decision making because they haven't had reviews to do it. Review articles become necessary to advance addiction science by providing a systematic summary of existing evidence, while coming up with new ideas and pointing out the unique contribution of the work, which may provide a great challenge for inexperienced researchers. And certainly, trying to do a review article if you don't know the field is quite difficult. It's actually important that you know something about the field you're trying to review. Next slide. Now, one of the things that you need to do if you're going to write a review paper is find out what the criteria is for the journal that you've chosen. And I use two examples here. One is the Czech journal Addictology, and they say their criteria is a cogent summary of topical issues, the author's own experience is not the underlying theme for the paper. Maximum extent is 16 pages, with not more than 50 bibliographic citations, and literature not more than 5 years old should prevail. Addiction, which is published in Britain, reviews simply draw together a body of literature to reach one or more main conclusions, up to 4,000 words, but no limit on citations. And one of the problems sometimes with reviews is that you do get too many citations in it. You get citations that are saying the same thing and just repeating themselves. So it is important to be aware of that. And as I say, if you look at the first one, they say that no more than 50. And also this business about age, that's important, unless, of course, there is a review. It's a review of which historical aspects are important. And next slide. Writing a review paper. Systematic reviews use explicit literature research strategies, inclusion and exclusion criteria for determining the quality and reliability of the study findings. So there is always a methodology that is used to do this. As with all research, systematic review should be replicable and the conclusions drawn by the authors more easily verifiable. So as we've always said since we started this series of webinars, things should be replicable, and that's in the method section, so we know that someone else will do the same thing. Systematic review that does not include evaluation of study findings is referred to as a hybrid narrative review. So sometimes you get a review which reviews the literature but doesn't include the findings of each study. Next slide. Hybrid narrative reviews provide authors with a greater freedom to interpret and integrate study results and conclusions compared to systematic reviews, but still allow the reader to determine the authenticity of the author's findings. Particularly important for theory development and problem identification, especially when peer-reviewed literature is incomplete, and when important studies may not use rigorous or experimental or longitudinal designs. Slide. And I'm just going to close the door because my washing machine is making a noise. Hang on. And have I lost you? Oh, God.
No, we're here. You're good.
Yes. I lost you for a minute, and it was anyway. Where are we? Steps to write a successful systematic review. State the aims of the review clearly as you would a research paper. So, as with all research, we should state what the aims are so people know why they're reading this paper. The aims will determine the choice of the specific procedure used to search sources and processes and present the results. In the concluding section of the study, stated whether and to what extent the aims have been fulfilled. So, and this is again is what is true of all research papers. You should go back and say, this was the aims, and we achieved this, or we didn't achieve this. Next slide. Steps to a successful systematic review. In a review, the research questions included and expressed in the text, formulated as the problem, the topic and focus of the work. The research question must correspond with the objectives of the study and be aligned with the methodology. So your research question has got to be about, you've stated what your objectives are, and that's what the research question must be about. And the methodology must be aligned so it's actually delivering what you're asking it to do. For an article investigating the quality and type of emotional bonds in young adults who use cannabis, the research question could be, for example, can insecure emotional bonds be associated with higher rate of cannabis use among young adults? So that's a sort of way that you might express the title of your research or your research question. Next slide. Identifying data sources. The primary and most important sources for data are electronic databases, typically accessed through university libraries. And this, of course, is very different from when I was at college, because we had to go to paper. We had to go to books called Psychological Abstracts and then order the papers. Of course, you can do this now for most places, but however many papers you can access will depend upon the level of access granted by the university to students and members of staff. So it will depend on what your university or your institution have made available to you. So it's not always the complete amount. You may have access to many databases, but access to the full text may be limited, leaving only the abstract, which may not be sufficient. And you do have to be very careful about abstracts because databases have the abstract, and sometimes you can quote them without the text, and then you suddenly find that it says something a little different than you actually intended to say. Next slide. Right, now here's a slide for you to keep to look at the databases that you will that you can visit, and this is a useful slide for you. So it's perhaps worth trying to print that one off and keeping it somewhere where you can access it. Next slide. As well as databases and full text studies, it's also possible to include conference presentations if the conference abstracts have been published. And this is a bit difficult because some journals may not accept these if they did not go through a peer review process. And many big international conferences have a peer review process for looking at the papers before they accept the paper for the conference, but not all do. And that may be a then question of quality. You may also include monographs, articles in peer-reviewed non-index journals, handbooks and manuals relating to the topic, graduate theses and dissertations. These can be included in the category records identified through other sources in the PRISMA study flow diagram. And one of the things that you know I found when I did and I mentioned this before, when I did my doctoral research, there was virtually no data, so I had to rely on all sorts of data, some of which had not been published, in order to actually provide something. So, steps to successful selection criteria. Year of publication, designating the period that is under study may be the first criterion. So you might say, I want to only have papers from 2010 or from 2015. But as I said, it may be if it's has historical aspects to it, you may want to include all citations. Number of the citations in the article. This can be found in the database, usually under the heading Times Cited. So you can find out how often this paper that you're looking at has been cited. Articles with a greater number of citations report on more prestigious research. Keywords reflecting the terminology in a given field and also help identify the most relevant studies. I mean, this you'll know this from doing your own research, that you know, if you start putting in keywords, they are crucial in finding the papers that you want. And that's also a reflection of when you write your papers, make sure you include the keywords that will show people to your study. Next slide. Relevance of the article. Databases may turn up a number of articles, but because of potential overlap of keywords and other parameters, some work may be inconsistent with the focus of the review. It's necessary to read through all articles or abstracts to exclude irrelevant work. And that's one of the problems, that sometimes people may entitle their work something which isn't actually related to your review, although it may come up as if it appears to be. Type of publication. Although you may work from original and review studies only, specific topics may require information from annual reports, research reports, or guidelines. It's important to state these facts in the description of the procedure. So when you give a prescription of the procedure, you know, that's what you need to do. Next slide. Study design. Research studies may be further divided into subcategories. For example, reviews versus original works, or with clinical issues, cross-sectional versus longitudinal. Language of publication is important. Languages that predominate in science publishing are English and Spanish, with Chinese emerging as a significant language of science. And it is a problem that if you are researching a topic for which there may be papers published in French or Italian, which are much rarer, or not so much in the French, but you know, will you actually access those or not? Web of Science databases provide the option of searching studies in Chinese. Sometimes the Chinese studies are translated into English, and that makes it easier. Next slide. Socio-demographic environment is useful to describe the socio-demographic environment in which the study was conducted, as it may interview the review results. The review needs to take account of this when presenting the research results. So, for example, if you are researching something about substance use or some such thing, you need to know, or people may need to know, what the background of the people you are studying. Funding sources and conflicts of interest. The funding sources of the study and other conflicts of interest may influence how the results are interpreted. Significant biases have been uncovered when the funding source or the authors have a financial stake in the results of the study. This is one of the difficulties that why it is important to look at the funding sources, because sometimes you'll find that, for example, studies may be funded by the alcohol industry, tobacco industry, the gambling industry, or even the pharmaceutical industry. If they're talking about a specific drug, they may pay researchers to write that research paper. And that, of course, may well bias the findings. Next slide. I'm sorry, this is probably small for you. But this is the PRISMA study flow diagram, which is very useful and should be included in review studies. So it shows how you selected the papers, and the various criteria that you went through, and how papers were included or excluded as you went through. And this is now common for most review papers. They will have a study flow diagram. So I'm sure you'll be able to see that better if you can have that have the slides. Next slide. Interpretation of results. As well as the PRISMA diagram, results should be further summarized in a structured form, like a table, according to the classification criteria. It's advisable to compare the qualitative and quantitative perspectives of the study. So quite often with review papers that I receive in my journal, there is a long, as well as the papers mentioned in the text and in the reference list, there's a table describing what the papers were, and that's actually very useful. When using the quantitative perspective, follow the number of studies that use a longitudinal versus cross-sectional design, how many studies use a standardized methodology versus one developed for the study, how many studies balance the participants in terms of representativeness, and how many did not. So there's all sorts of criteria that you may need to look at in terms of whether they're standard or whether it's for something which may be an unusual topic, they may have developed a particular methodology for this particular study. And then how many studies are balanced in participants in terms of representatives and how many did not. So what you need to know, and this is one of the things that is difficult. Sometimes I get papers submitted to my journal which say, look at student smoking. And then you discover when you read the paper that it's actually only females. And therefore that is not representative of the population or males or whatever. Qualitative studies make it possible to look for broader aspects of the work and the finer subtleties in the results that have been ascertained. And we've said this when we talked about qualitative work. It is for me, it is one of the joys of reading good qualitative work, because you tend to understand the subject better. Next slide. Interpretation of results. The interpretation of the results should always be based on results and findings specified in a given study. You must refrain from adding any conclusions of your own, because a principal rule is to preserve and express the original author's ideas as precisely as possible. When formulating the ideas and working with other review studies, you should always look up the primary source and interpret its results. Other review studies may serve as an inspiration in classifying your results rather than being their source, functioning rather as background material. So be careful when you interpret results. You need to, as it says earlier there, you need to preserve the original ideas, author's ideas, as precisely as possible. Next slide. Any copyright rules should be observed when making citations. Strictly avoid using findings presented by the original authors in their research as your interpretations. So if the original author has made some findings, don't put it down as your interpretation. It's his or her interpretation. You should seek to be as accurate as possible and restate the author's original argument, looking up other relevant works on the topic that you will cite in the same way. Also necessary to be sensitive when interpreting the results from a different socio-cultural settings. Be careful not to make unreasonable generalizations and interpret the results in terms of a given social context. Next slide. Discussion and conclusion. Once the results have been processed and interpreted, you need to think about the results and compare them with conclusions drawn by other relevant studies. This requires you to bring a new perspective to the subject under study, singling out and discussing the most salient findings from the results. Importantly, the discussion should compare and evaluate the results against other relevant research projects, rather than against the presentation of the author's opinion on the issue. So it is a review. It is supposed to be objective, and therefore you need to be very objective in how you compare and discuss the results. And as it says in the second paragraph, it brings you to a new perspective by actually deciding what the most salient results from the findings are from the results. Next slide. Each idea or result presented in the article needs to be properly cited too. The conclusion consists of a practical evaluation of the study. It should not contain any new findings or evidence. So this is about reviewing other papers. They've got to be properly cited so other people can follow them up. The conclusion needs to be the practical evaluation of the study. Its purpose is to briefly summarize the results and contribution of the study as a whole. It's important to practice communicating your own views concisely. Next slide. Each idea or result presented in the article needs to be properly cited too. Conclusion consists of a practical evaluation of the study. It should not contain any new findings or evidence. Its purpose is to briefly summarize the results and the contribution of the study as a whole, and it is your paper. Some journals prefer separate discussion and conclusion sections. Others prefer to combine them. I think one thing we're finding now is, and I recommend this to authors, is that to have a separate conclusion section at the end, because not long, but really it's a summary of the most important parts of the discussion. Next slide. Oh, I don't know what's happened with that one. I can't read it.
Oh, it looks fine for us.
It's all broken up for me. I can read
At least for me.
the last line. I can read. I can't.
All right. Well, would you like me to?
Could you? And I've lost you again now.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you read the first 2 points on that slide?
So this talks about potential problems, and it says that a problem that may be encountered when comparing results between studies is the difference in the number of participants. Many studies do not use a representative sample of participants, and great differences in their sizes may strongly affect the study generalizability. And then the second one says, citation bias may significantly compromise the results. Try to avoid this if you want to arrive at a conclusion that is relevant to the field.
And then the last point is, if there is a citation bias, peer reviewers are likely to discover it. So they're likely to find it anyway. And is there another slide? I can't read that one either. But I don't know what's happened here. The whole of the text is broken up. It's strange.
Oh, strange. Well, so it's a continuing on potential problems. It's also necessary to consider during the interpretation process the statistical versus clinical significance of studies. In a large number of cases, you'll find that the results are not reflected in clinical practice despite being significant. It's therefore important to maintain contact with clinical practitioners to be able to compare the results with real life. You can then formulate how these significances correlate in the conclusion.
Yeah, and this, of course, is very important. If it's a clinical issue that you're talking about, you need to, it's important to interact with those clinical practitioners. So you actually are these results, do they compare with real life? Thank you, Kerry. Is there any more slides?
Yeah.
Oh no, that's fine. That's suddenly clear. Why? I don't know why. Ah. For addiction science, the critical evaluation of systematic reviews is important. It is a key to the correct interpretation of selective data from particular studies, provides a background for comparing findings, and can help identify potentially disproportionate or inhomogeneous interpretations of findings. So, there is so much being published now that systematic reviews can be immensely important to you, providing they are well done. Tendency to interpret data in a different way and present specific points of view can be a potential source of bias, e.g., contrasting study findings in the area of the tobacco policy, depending on whether the study was or not funded by the tobacco industry. So that's what I was saying about sources of funding. It's very important. And the tobacco industry have been particularly, should I say, naughty or active in terms of their interpretation of or their funding of science, which seeks to justify their industry, which is of course a very big and money-making industry. Next slide. That's it. Yep.
Yep, that's it.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry about that. It went a bit pear-shaped, but so any questions? Any thoughts? Review papers are important, but they do require a lot of work if you want to do them, and it's certainly if you're working in clinical practice, it's much harder to do one than say if you're working in a university where you have access to databases and possibly more time to do it. But there we are.
Does anyone have experience with working in these kind of papers?
I mean, as I say, you do in a sense, in that when you're writing your research paper, you're doing a little mini literature review. So you have got experience, but you imagine the whole paper is based on that.
Right.
And so they are very useful in terms of looking at policy. And what is frustrating is if you're trying to research a relatively new topic, it's very it's very frustrating if you find there is no literature. I reviewed a paper for my journal this morning, which was about sickle cell disease in Nigeria and the problems that some people will, because of the pain involved with sickle cell, some people will develop a problem with opiate use. And of course, that is very new to me, and it's useful to have the background on that. Okay, and there's three things. One is that we want to review Gia's paper. Secondly, we need to set a date for the final webinar of the series.
Right.
And thirdly is particularly you want to include in that last session. One thing I will be doing is I'll be tidying up bits and pieces and things like responding to reviewers and just so you can understand better the way to do this and how to make your paper more likely to be accepted. But if there's particular things you want to talk about, then please let me know. either now or email me separately.
And just to toot our horns for a second, Dr. Pates, I don't know if you got to see the email from one of our former students from the first session, but they just got their paper published. So we got another one of our colleagues from our first session who was published after doing work with you.
And that's really satisfying, and it's lovely to know that it works. I've enjoyed these seminars immensely, but also the fact that people are writing papers, people are experienced. It's not like working with a group of undergraduates who, won't be at this stage in their careers yet. So it is lovely to be working with you and to see the work you're producing. So you're quite right. Thank you for raising that, Gary. I did get the email and I haven't responded to it yet, but I did see your very exuberant response.
I was very excited. Yep. And his was in the I think the Journal of Gambling. So that's interesting. It's a little bit, not directly what we're used to talking about, but certainly, highly relevant.
Yeah. Yes, and it is very interesting. And I think one of the things that has been interesting both in that series of webinars we did and in this series is the breadth of papers that we have, or breadth of subjects we've seen in the papers, and it shows that our field has a lot of stuff and the very interesting things for policy and all sorts of things. So it is it's a pleasure doing it because you learn so much and you see how many different topics people are tackling.
Yeah, it's never dull.
Certainly never dull, no. So where do we want to go next? Shall we look at Chia's paper?
Yes.
Well, I've looked at Chia's paper, and I have to say it is very good. It's also very important because I think things that we're all working in the field of addiction, and Chia's paper is about access to drug treatment services, and really highlighting the problem that there are not enough services and there's not enough training of staff in places like universities or perhaps training courses on the subject of addiction. So many of the staff don't have the background, and I guess that was certainly true of the UK when I started. People didn't get trained in addiction, and one of the things that I am so delighted to work with ICU DDR is that in fact they are encouraging the expansion of studying of substance use in university courses, because it is one of the things you all know is it's so important in many areas of work, and because as a psychologist, when I trained, I worked with children, I worked with the elderly, I worked with adults, and all of these groups have their own particular problems with substances. Anyway, to get back to Chia's paper, really good. My main comments on it is about language, really. And what I will do is what I've done with all of them, Chia. I will go through it and just revise the language for you. There is a temptation, and this is not just you. It's often people from Africa and the Indian subcontinent is often not using the definite article the. So you have in the first sentence, this study examined the condition of drug treatment workforce in Nigeria, when it should be the drug treatment workforce in Nigeria. That's a small thing, but it's the sort of thing which we don't want to get a paper sent back to you for revision for things like that. So I will go through it and check all the language for you, but it's worth remembering in the future to get someone else to read it to see what they think of the paper and what they think of the language. The only other point that I had was that you said on page 3, let's have a look, talking about WHO 2006 further observed public health work shortages are even more critical in the developing world. For example, sub-Saharan Africa has 11% of the world's population and 24% of global burden of disease, yet its commands less than 1% of the world's health expenditure. In another related publication, WHO 2006 maintained there is a major mismatch between population needs and available public health workforce in terms of overall numbers, etc. Now, one of the things I would comment on this, or suggest that you comment on it, is that paper, well, that report from WHO is 2006, so that's 14, 15 years ago that the work was done, and make sure there hasn't been major changes since then. I know that, so pardon me, I did work with UNODC in training people in Nigeria back in 2015. So it may be updated, and I'm sure you're still right. But I think when you cite older reports, it's worth commenting that this situation is still relevant. Otherwise, people might pick you up on that. But other than that, I had no to criticism of the paper. I thought it was a good paper. I thought it was modest actually in its findings, because I think the reality is that I think, as you've said, Nigeria is a big country population wise. It does have a big problem with substances. And we know that actually that lots of West Africa does, because of it's a transition route for drugs coming in from places like South America. And you're quite right. It's a very interesting area to highlight, and I'm really glad that you wrote the paper. So I will come back to you, Chia, and give you full a full revised version of the paper with the editorial comments. But are there other things you want to say about it? I feel I've been talking non-stop.
When I don't know if you know Igor, right? Igor Kutsanak, Dr. Kutsanak. When we were doing a class the other day, and everyone had their cameras off and everyone was quiet, and he's like, "I hope you're not all in comas." We would love to hear voices other than our own.
Yes. And one of the other things is that when you don't hear voices, you're not sure that whether everyone still has the, not that they're in a coma, but whether there's been a technological issue that's like I have with the slides, So
Right, absolutely. Dr. Francis, is that feedback that Dr. Pates gave you helpful? As you say, there may be technical issues, especially Dr. Francis is joining us from Nigeria, and sometimes
yeah,
it breaks, but that's a great thing about the recording, is we'll get to share that. And so
yeah,
if he didn't hear all your feedback, he'll be able to hear it then.
it's very eerie, isn't it, when it's just the two of us talking?
We can just chat, Was anyone else able to review the paper? Well, I guess we can move on to, does anyone have an opinion about when we should meet next? Because I think Dr. Pates and I are of the same mind to wait and finish up in January. Is that okay with everyone?
It'll mean, I think, something like a 3-week gap rather than a 2-week gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking of January, okay, I'm seeing some chats that they're okay with that. The only thing about if you're thinking of the 4th, I have to check because I do have a training with Uganda, and I have to make sure see what the timing is. But I could send something out to this group and make sure the timing works, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
Um,
The other thing is to ask people whether there's a paper that can review.
yes, we need a paper. Tadeus, did you have a paper that was ready for us? I think maybe you were close. We might get a comment in the chat more than a verbal, because I think some people are having an easier time with that. Yeah, and if not, like you said, we could wrap up some loose ends or final things and answer questions if people want to submit questions or things of that nature. We don't
And
have Verna. She's usually our talker.
yeah, and certainly if people want to, if there are things people want to include, let me know beforehand, and I'll be very happy to include them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see that last session as really almost a tidying up session as well as anything else.
Right.
But just remember though that if you want to contact me after the series is finished, you've got my email address, and I'm very happy to hear from you.
Well, why don't we do this since people may be having connectivity issues? Oh, Marisol says she'll send her last version of her paper, so that'll be great.
Thank you, Marisol.
But since people may be having, audio issues or connectivity or maybe not as talkative today, I can send out an email with some of these, let us know what you want to work on, maybe submit some questions ahead of time. Does this date and time work for you? And we can and also I'll send it to the larger group since there's some people who are not here today and have been with us on other days. That sound good for you, Dr. Pates?
Sounds good to me. Yep. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, was there another thing, or that's all of their Dr.
No, it was about paper.
Yep.
People wanted a date, so we covered that really.
Okay, great. Yeah, so why don't we have the rest of our communication on via email then, and I'll include the larger group, as I said, because I know Verna usually likes to join us, and she may have been busy today, but we may have a few other people who join us for the final session.
Great. Yep.
All right. Well, thank you all, and I'm gonna end our session today.